Welcome to Exploring the Bi-Edge. This episode, part 2 of our Pampas series, we'll be diving into the spectacular megafauna that the Pampas housed more than 10,000 years ago. My understanding is that it's well known that the megafauna around the world died off 10, 20,000 years ago. That's a well-known fact. But what is not well known is that the Pampas was an outlier in many respects, with a megafauna that was surprisingly diverse and strange compared with the rest of the world. And that question is, as to why that was so, is not often tackled. Here we do that. Looking forward to it. Over to you.
Hi, Anthony. Yes, well, the topic of the megafauna of the Pampas is truly an interesting one ecologically, because it seems to defy ecological principles in so many ways. And so maybe we can begin by asking ourselves, well, what was this megafauna of the Pampas, consisting of mammals with a body mass more than 1 ton? That means more than 1,000 kilograms body mass for adults. Animals that had lived in the Pampas for the whole of the late Pleistocene, but then went extinct near the start of the Holocene. In some cases, the Holocene starts about 10,000 years ago. Some of these species went extinct maybe 12,000 years ago, some as recently perhaps as 7,000 years ago. But as a fauna, it went extinct pretty much centered on the start of the Holocene about 10,000 years ago, which corresponds more or less to the nearest few thousand years with the advent of human hunter-gatherers, the first wave of human colonization from the north that penetrated South America. Bearing in mind, this is an important part of the overall framework, is bear in mind that one of the great puzzles of the Americas is how late the human species colonized the Americas. This has never really been explained. Humans have lived basically forever in Africa and Eurasia, and they only recently colonized fairly remote lands such as Madagascar and New Zealand. But there's two puzzles about human colonization which are relevant to a discussion of megaherbivores, because everybody suspects that the humans are the ones who wiped out the megaherbivores in the Pampas and elsewhere. And those two surprising facts are that humans very early reached the Australasian realm, including Australia, the island continent. They reached Australia by 50,000, that's 50,000 years ago, which involved going over the sea on boats. So they managed to do that. They managed to reach the island continent 50,000 years ago, but they only seem to have reached the Americas perhaps at the earliest 20,000 years ago, and perhaps only 15,000 years ago, despite the fact that for most of the Pleistocene, they could actually walk from Eurasia onto the American continent across the land bridge of Beringia. So it's deeply puzzling. Notwithstanding the icy coldness of Beringia, nonetheless, it's deeply puzzling that human beings who got to Australia so early failed to reach the Americas for 30,000 years beyond that. So after the first Australians were living happily in Australia, it took another 30,000 years, at least, closer to 40,000 years, before people bothered to walk across from what is now Siberia to what is now Alaska. And then once they reached Alaska, they seem to have spread southwards very rapidly, colonizing the whole of North America, Central America, even the Caribbean islands, and then eventually reaching right to the southern tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego. So once humans got in there, they seem to have swept across the country, the land, on the time scale of a few thousand years. And so they reached, yeah.
Sorry if I can interrupt you there.
Yeah.
Are you saying that the cold conditions up in Siberia and the Arctic should not have been too much of a barrier for those humans, given that, that we know that the Inuit can survive in cold conditions. So is the puzzle that getting to Australia was tricky on boats, etc., but getting through Siberia, the Arctic, it really shouldn't have been a problem, because we know that humans can adapt to and manage such cold conditions. Or is it possible that it was much colder and just impossible for humans to survive in those icy landscapes, 30,000 years ago? Is that a possible solution to this problem?
Well, that's part of it, and that seems unlikely for at least two reasons. Number one reason is that even if people were not able to walk across icy Beringia, they could have basically gone on boats from the easternmost part of Eurasia to the westernmost parts of North America. If it's possible to travel on boats at all, they should have been able to do that, maybe by hugging the coast. But more particularly, two of our extinct human species in our genus Homo, namely Neanderthals and Denisovans, were apparently adapted to icy conditions. Certainly Neanderthals were. They were restricted mainly to Europe, but the Denisovans were an Asian human species that seems to have been adapted to the Central Asian highlands, which are icy. And so it's difficult to imagine that human beings couldn't, at least at relatively favorable times, negotiate that land bridge. Many other mammals did. For example, one of the most spectacular examples is the wapiti of North America, which many people regard as a characteristically North American species of large deer, sometimes known as the elk. That is essentially a Chinese deer. So much so that to this day you can find wapiti in Siberia or northern China that are, even at the subspecies level, indistinguishable from the wapiti in North America. So in the case of the wapiti, it's a Chinese deer that was made to order for America, and all it needed to do was just walk across. So it's difficult to imagine that humans couldn't do that. So this is all a little bit of a digression, because what we're trying to set is the scene whereby suddenly, out of the blue, after a whole Pleistocene of evolution, the Pampas was beset by a new predator, an unlikely looking predator, a bipedal predator with hardly any teeth or claws, that just wandered onto the scene and somehow seems to have wiped out every large mammal down to the size of about 50 kilograms, including all of the diverse mammals above 1 ton. So what were those mammals that they wiped out? Let's assume that the extinction of the Pampas megafauna was down to humans. Let's ask ourselves, what did, imagine that you're an initial colonizer, one of those humans who actually stumbled on the Pampas, something like maybe 13,000 years ago, onto this vast area, and you encountered the animals that your species was about to drive to extinction over the next few thousand years. What were they? Well, it may come as a surprise to some people to realize that one of the species there was an elephant very similar in size and shape and probably function to the elephants that remain today, the African and the Indian elephant, African or the Asian elephant. So there was an elephant there. It happened to be in a different genus called Notiomastodon, but we can regard it very much as a typical elephant. Then below that, there was a spectacular radiation of xenarthran mammals, what used to be called edentates, and the xenarthrans are composed of ground sloths, some of which were gigantic, and glyptodons, which are like colossal armadillos. So the Xenarthra consist of two main orders, and the one order is the same order in which the surviving sloths occur, and that had the ground sloths in it, 3 families of ground sloths, one of which, Megatherium, was as big as an elephant, although of a very different shape. And the other order, the Cingulata, the order of the armadillos, had what effectively were giant armadillos in the form of glyptodons, which are truly bizarre animals. a little bit like a cross between a mammal and a tortoise, several species. And so we can imagine that the first human colonizers of the Pampas encountered a whole fauna of xenarthrans in the form of ground sloths and glyptodonts. Next in line, we had so-called, well, they were like the South American equivalent of ungulates. Now, ungulates, proper hoofed mammals, evolved in the Old World and then moved into North America across the Bering Strait, and some of them finally went down into South America, like the camelids, resulting in the vicuña and the llama and the guanaco. But South America, when it was isolated more than 6 million years ago as an island continent, a bit like Australia, evolved its own ungulate-like animals. And two orders are involved. There's an order called the Lepopterna and an order called the Noto ungulata, instead of the old world orders, which are the Artiodactyla and the Perissodactyla. So in the case of the Lepopterna, we've got a very strange animal, which we have almost complete skeletons for, but which is difficult to reconstruct because it's so different from anything that's alive, called Macrauchenia. And Macrauchenia we can discuss a little bit later with respect to how it weathered attacks from the saber-toothed cat. But it was apparently one of the commoner and more widespread of the sort of para-ungulates of South America, which attained a large body size on the Pampas of about 1 ton. So about the same body mass as a giraffe, and with a slightly elongated neck, but nothing really like a giraffe beyond that. And then in the Noto ungulata, there was an almost rhino-like para-ungulate called Toxodon, which again is quite well represented by skeletons and which again looks quite different from anything we see in the living fauna. And then just to complete the picture, there was a giant camel, which is closely related to modern camels. And that's more or less the fauna of the Pampas. So we go from elephants through to ground sloths through to something approaching ungulates.
Were the elephants related to the mastodons from up north? And do you know how many different species of these elephants there were? I saw some pictures of animals with enormous tusks, but I thought there were several types.
Yeah, it seems that as studies of the fossil fauna of the Pampas proceed, it seems like it's becoming clearer and clearer that there was only one species on the Pampas.
Oh, okay.
In the genus Notiomastodon, and it was comparable with a mastodon. That's probably the best comparison. And obviously mastodons differ somewhat from modern elephants, but in a broad sense, you can think of it as an elephant,
right,
or a mastodon.
Do you think
whether you call a mastodon an elephant or not is a moot point.
Yeah. And so the thinking is that these animals were vulnerable to human hunting tactics, that they were handling the saber-toothed cat, but they just couldn't handle humans. Is that the general thought?
Yeah, well, there's some plausibility in that because, okay, we all acknowledge that humans are a ferocious foe. We can see that in modern times because so many faunas have been badly affected by hunting by humans. But it still comes as a surprise that the sparse populations of technically primitive people that colonized South America were so ferociously effective in wiping out whole faunas of large mammals. Even if you give humans full credit for their hunting prowess, it's still surprising how complete that extinction spate was. So we have to ask, well, what was it about the actual faunas involved that laid them open to relatively rapid extermination? And here a comparison between Africa and the Pampas might be somewhat helpful because in Africa, the difference is that the large mammals, including the megaherbivores, all evolved with people. So human beings came up from Australopithecus through to primitive species of Homo through to modern Homo sapiens in Africa, and all along the line, as they became more technically proficient and more dangerous, the prey animals were able to adapt to them, to the degree that the modern African elephant was perfectly capable of living among the indigenous people of Africa, simply because it was unusually intelligent for a mammal and had certain behaviors, fear-related and social behaviors, that enabled it to defend itself to some degree. In the case of the giraffe of Africa, the obvious reason why it survived Aboriginal hunting was because the giraffe is astonishingly rapid in its growth and reproduction and metabolism. It grows like a proverbial mushroom for a mammal, and so it can sustain a certain amount of offtake. Hippos have something going for them because they can breed fairly rapidly, and they also have a very good refuge in water. Rhinos are a bit more puzzling because they seem a little inept. But they have, the African rhinos do have a fairly pronounced defensive repertoire. So we can explain the survival of megaherbivores to the modern times in Africa by the idea that they've co-adapted, in a sense, with humans all along the line of human evolution. In the Americas, particularly the Pampas, there was no such preparedness. And so what happened was that a naive fauna was suddenly beset by human predation. And moreover, the difference is that the entire group of mega herbivores in the Pampas that we've called the xenarthrans, namely the ground sloths and the glyptodons, were different from any living megafaunal animal in the sense of having a very slow pace of life. You can see that in the surviving sloths of the Central and South American rainforests. They have very slow metabolism, low body temperature, slow reproduction, slow growth. And there's no reason to suspect that the giant ground sloths and the glyptodons were not similar. They probably also had really slow pace of life. And because slow pace of life includes slow reproduction, it's relatively easy to wipe out a species with slow pace of life, simply because it's not able to replace dead individuals rapidly.
So how do they survive with a saber-toothed cat wandering around plucking them off?
Well, you see, the incidence of the indigenous large predators. Now, let's ask ourselves, well, what are the large predators of the Pampas at the time of human arrival? Yeah. The main species to think about is a saber-toothed cat called Smilodon populator, which was the largest ever member of the Felidae, weighing more than 300 kilograms and up to 400 kilograms. So think of it as twice as massive as the modern lion. And different from the modern lion in the fact in not only having a shorter tail, but having a much more thick-set, brawny, wrestler-type body build, heavy forequarters, thick neck, heavy head, and of course, magnificent saber-like canines. So that was the main species. But there was also the modern lion, possibly the same species, Panthera leo, as the modern lion. It's not as well appreciated as it should be that the lion, Panthera leo, or a closely related species, was widely present in America, including North America and much of South America, in the late Pleistocene. It was a very widespread species. It extended from Africa all across Eurasia, all across Beringia, into North America, and down into South America. So in the Pampas, you had both the largest cat of all, the South American saber-toothed cat, and the modern lion. And then you also had Canis diurus, the dire wolf, and a species of short-faced bear, a long-legged bear with a short face that was specialized on carnivory. You can think of it as a nightmare hyena, is possibly the best analogy, because it was capable of running down prey with its long legs and killing prey as a carnivore, a cursorial carnivore, rather than a stalking one. But it was also probably capable of crunching bones, by analogy to a modern hyena. And then lurking around the periphery of that ecosystem were the modern jaguar and the modern puma, and of course a whole lot of smaller predators as well. But the main one to focus on here is the saber-toothed cat, because it seems that the saber-toothed cat, Smilodon populator, was specifically adapted for killing mega herbivores, killing prey, the adults of which were more than 1,000 kilograms in body mass. And we can examine in a minute how it did that with its rather improbable teeth, because we have no modern cat that can show us how those teeth worked. So we have to sort of infer from the fossils how they could possibly have worked.
And so these slow breeding animals managed to somehow stave off all these carnivores. It's difficult to imagine how that
Yes,
would
I
happen.
didn't answer your question. Yeah, to come back to your question, the question is about pressure of carnivory on the prey base. Now, the basic principle here is that whatever the prey base is, however abundant the prey animals are, and however rapidly they reproduce and replace themselves, that sets the incidence of predators, because the predators have no capacity to live beyond their means. And so whatever the availability of prey is, so you will have a certain incidence of predators that is geared not to exterminate the prey, but simply to live off it, like in any ecosystem. So there's no real puzzle as to how the megaherbivores sustained predation, but the numbers of the predators were adjusted to the availability of the prey. What changed is that when humans came, they were essentially hyper carnivorous in the sense that they could kill things with greater efficiency than the indigenous predators could, and across a larger range of body sizes. And so they basically overkilled in the way that human beings tend to do. And that outstripped the capacity of the mega herbivores in the Pampas to replace themselves, if that makes sense.
Right, but there's invariably also an arms race between predator and prey, as we've discussed before. Like the Chacma baboon's canines are similar length to the leopard, and the large male Chacma baboon is actually a scary foe potentially for a leopard. And gazelles can outrun a cheetah because they swerve more effectively. I just can't picture how that arms race plays out between a giant sloth and a saber-toothed cat. It just it seems heavily skewed in favor of the saber-tooth.
Yes. Well, let's think about that for a second. Okay, so at the level of intelligence, for example, a saber-toothed cat probably had a very average mammalian intelligence based on its brain size, based on the fossil evidence.
Okay.
Most cats do. They have a very average mammalian intelligence. There's no doubt that the ground sloths and the glyptodons were small-brained. They were lacking in the braininess department, which is consistent with their slow metabolism, their slow movement, their slow reproduction, their slow growth. So they were slow in every aspect of their lives, including their thinking. But what they had going for them was, in the case of Megatherium and Eremiotherium, they had sheer size, possibly up to 6 tons, which is as big as the biggest elephant today. So they were really large compared to a 300-kilogram saber-toothed cat, Smilodon populator. And secondly, they had their own kind of defense, because one of the advantages of the body plan of a ground sloth is that it can sit back on a combination of its hind feet and its tail, and it can use its enormous 4 claws to defend itself. And however stupid the animal is, and however slow-moving it is, it still has the capacity to act rapidly and lethally enough to be a formidable foe. We see that in a slightly modified form in the extant, the living giant anteater of South America, which is pathetically slow. I mean, if you find a giant anteater in the bush in South America, you can very easily keep up with it. It's not an animal that can flee from you. And yet it has a reputation for lethality, because even that slow-moving, almost blind-looking animal can really do you in with its front claws. And so you only need one good defense to maintain that arms race, maintain that relationship with your predator that enables you to survive. In the case of the glyptodons, the defense is extreme and obvious, which is that they were possibly the most extremely structurally defended, or shall we say, shelled mammals that have ever existed. I mean, they really, an armadillo is quite a shelled animal, but the glyptodons were shelled to the point that they look almost alien.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
that compensates for their dim wits and their slow movement.
Okay, no, it's wonderful imagining the scenes that would have played out on the Pampas, the sloth against the saber-toothed cat. Why is it that average zoologists, ecologists across the world are largely unaware of how spectacular this fauna was? Why do you think this incredible savanna wildlife-like scene is not etched in the global psyche?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because it's so nuanced. I think part of it is that South America is not an Anglophone culture. And so there's not that much natural history material that comes from the Latin Americans into the Western world. In fact, there's quite a lot of science done in a place like Argentina, but it tends to be a little bit hidden to the Anglophone world. There's not the same culture of natural history, not the same culture of naturalism in Latin America as there is in Britain and America and Australia and New Zealand. And also, I think that the mind boggles a little when confronting the improbability, the sheer far-fetchedness of what happened in South America. Because South America, more than any other landmass, illustrates the almost unbelievable turnover from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. That's so deeply puzzling that the mind recoils from it. It's almost like a case of cognitive dissonance. And we can definitely accept that some part of the extinction of the megafauna in South America can be laid at the feet of the humans. But even so, it seems remarkable because we're talking about people with very primitive tools. Even if we grant them an incentive of, being greedy and short-sighted enough to kill off every last member of a whole genus and family, like for example, the megafauna in the Pampas consists of whole families that were driven extinct by humans. It's still one of the more far-fetched things because it's not as if the American indigenous people had the might of a civilization behind them when they exterminated the mega herbivores of the Pampas. When the Spaniards arrived there in 1516, they didn't find cities and farms and the kind of human activity that could explain and justify the extermination of a megafauna. What they found was essentially an empty place, a pasture that stretched for hundreds or thousands of kilometers with basically nothing but waving grass. If you went in and, the Spaniards went in and explored a bit, they would find a few people. And those people were just simply living in leather tents and using, they were so bereft of wood or anything like that, no stone and no wood. So they used spears made out of reeds, Phragmites reeds, very primitive people, really. Very resource poor in the sense of what you expect from a conquering population. So it's difficult to imagine that such a feeble people in many ways, such a technically feeble people were able simply to march in and over a period of several thousand years wipe out every last individual of, a dozen large mammal species.
Absolutely. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
Coming back to the question of the arms race, there's one particular example of the arms race on the Pampas that I'd like to mention because it's one of these red in tooth and claw examples that will probably strike at the imagination of listeners. The skeleton of the Litoptern, the sort of autochthonous South American ungulate-like animal called Macrauchenia, was studied quite exhaustively by an author called Farina and his co-workers, and they found some peculiar things which deserve explanation. The limbs are strange on Litopterns, particularly Macrauchenia. And what it adds up to is that the limbs of this animal seem to be designed for sideways stresses, in distinction to modern ungulates, which are basically forward and forward runners. So when a lion pounces on a zebra or an antelope, that zebra is just trying to go forward. And if it's not trying to go forward, if the lion manages to jump on its back, then what it tends to do is to try to dislodge the predator by moving up and down. And we see that best in a rodeo, where both horses and bosts do spectacular up and down movements with their body to try and cast off an attacking animal in the form of a cowboy. But these lip-top terns, the cross-sectional diameter of their upper foreleg bone, the humerus, was thickened in a peculiar way that suggests that their main technique in evading the saber-toothed cat, Smilodon populator, was not so much up and down bucking or rapid acceleration, although they were fast runners based on their leg length, but it was a sideways jerking method. So you have to ask yourself, why did lip-top terns, such as Macrauchenia, we're talking about a 1,000 kilo, slightly camel-like, weird South American original para-ungulate, why did it have this peculiar skeleton, this peculiar limb configuration that suggests that it was designed for sideways movement, sideways stresses, as opposed to just forward movement or up and down bucking? And this is the rationale. A saber-toothed cat has a tremendously formidable pair of canines, but as with all things, there's a downside to it. And those long dagger-like canines were brittle. They were not robust puncturing devices. They're not just big Crocodile Dundee style daggers. What they are is delicate precision surgical instruments with a serrated posterior surface, narrow, laterally flattened, narrow, and very brittle compared to the teeth of a jaguar, for example. And the last thing that a Smilodon populator or a South American saber-toothed cat would be likely to do is, after having pounced on the back or rump of a Macrauchenia, bite into it, because that would be to risk the breakage of its precious canine teeth. When a lion jumps onto a zebra, it latches on with its claws and it tries to bite into the nape of the animal with its teeth to give it a fifth purchase that makes it difficult to dislodge. But with the saber-toothed cat, it had only its claws and its weight, because it couldn't apply its teeth. The teeth were reserved for the moment when the Smilodon, having knocked or wrestled the prey animal to the ground, having felled it, could go to the front end, the throat, either the throat up near the chin or maybe the throat lower down towards the chest, and use that slicing device of its saber teeth, the two canines, upper canines, to slice open the windpipe and possibly the arteries, killing it as quickly as possible. That's what seems to be the function for saber teeth. But in order for that killing bite to be deployed, the animal has to be knocked over, wrestled to the ground, pinned down, immobilized, because if the animal's struggling, again, the teeth risk being broken. So the whole gambit of a saber tooth was to bring down its prey. And because it was not a particularly rapid runner, it had to do that after an ambush and a rather brief pounce. And so the opportunity for the lip-top tern was to shake it off. And if it could shake it off, actually dislodge the saber-toothed cat from its back, then it had every chance of accelerating and running out of harm's way. And so the particular arms race in this case seems to have been that the lip-top tern evolved a way of jerking sideways in a way that we don't see in any modern quadrupedal animal. We see it a bit in ostriches, but they're bipeds, so they're not really analogous. But whereas we can envisage, a rodeo-style bucking in horses and antelopes, what happened with this lip-top tern is it didn't buck up and down. It had different hind legs as well, with a rather long femur relative to the tibia. And it also carried its neck horizontally rather than upright like a giraffe. So a different approach. And what it seems to have been adapted for was a violent sideways jerking, which used the mass of the of the attacking Smilodon against itself to dislodge it. And all of this is, of course, very much speculative, but it's in line with the fossil evidence.
Yeah, fascinating. And why do you think those saber teeth were necessary? The normal lion was there as well, and do you think the normal lion was unable to prey on some of these really large megafauna, whereas the saber-toothed cat could, and because of its teeth, were the normal lion's teeth just not good enough to kill these large mega herbivores? There are mega herbivores still in Africa that the current lion can bring down. So I'm trying to picture why these saber teeth evolved. Did they give it a major competitive advantage in hunting megafauna?
Yes, I think that the basic answer is that Smilodon populator and its North American relative, like in the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, which is Smilodon fatalis, these spectacular saber-toothed cats were mega herbivore specialists. Now, a lion is not a mega herbivore specialist. A lion will eat anything from a porcupine up to in some cases in Chobe in northern Botswana, young elephants.
Yeah.
But it's not a specialist, and it's gregarious. So what a lion has is a generalism across the board of prey from, say, 20 kilos up to several tons, and it has a gregarious method of hunting. It's fascinating to watch the lion hunt a male giraffe, an adult male giraffe, which can weigh 1,500 kilograms, 1.5 tons. And basically what they do is they just jump up onto it and they try to knock it down, because a giraffe has tremendous advantages, but its Achilles heel is instability. And if you can get a giraffe to the ground, even if it's 1.5 tons and you're only a few hundred kilos, then you have the advantage over it. So lions are indeed formidable and can kill mega herbivores, but what they don't have is a specialization on mega herbivores for whatever reason. There's nothing in the living fauna that is specialized in killing mega herbivores. And as testimony to the incidence of mega herbivores in the Americas, both North America and South America in the Pleistocene, that there was a whole genus, Smilodon, of large cats that seems to have been specialized on killing animals with an adult body mass of more than a ton. That doesn't mean that they didn't occasionally kill something smaller, but it means that their particular niche in the world, in contradistinction to the coexisting lion and jaguar and puma, was to specialize on these otherwise difficult prey. And we can suppose then that the saber teeth were specially crafted by evolution to be just the thing to kill as quickly as possible an animal that, by virtue of its body size, had a tremendous capacity to struggle and to injure the predator. So that seems to be the answer, is that the saber teeth are an anti-mega herbivore weapon.
So what, those teeth are particularly useful in that final killing of the animal once it's on the ground, and the lion was not as effective as with that final killing. The animal could struggle and get up and run away from the lion, whereas the saber tooth has used its teeth to slaughter it before it runs away again.
Yes, a lion may seem to be an effective killer, an efficient killer, but it's a little bit blunt in the sense that when a lion brings down, say, for example, a mature African buffalo, so you've got a lioness, they probably do it in groups, but you've got, say, 2 lionesses of 100 kilos each, bringing down a 500 kilo or more mature African buffalo. The way that they kill that animal is not to puncture it with their teeth, but to snuff out its breathing apparatus.
I've witnessed that. Oh, it's awful.
With a smaller antelope, they'll either clamp the throat, or with a larger one, often just clamp on the nose.
Yeah.
And so essentially the way lions, modern lions, kill animals is to asphyxiate them, which often is quite effective because it comes after a strenuous sprint in which there's an oxygen debt in the first place.
Yeah.
And we can take that for granted because the cheetah does the same thing. It seems unremarkable. But that's not the only way of killing something. And for example, with an elephant, it's difficult to do that. It's difficult to asphyxiate any kind of elephant because you'd have to block off both its proboscis and its mouth. It's basically impossible. Now that you mention it, litopterns, this is fascinating. I'd never, it's wonderful that when you discuss something, what gets brought to light that was just hidden slightly below the surface. One of the most odd facts about Macrauchenia, the litoptern that we're talking about, was the placement of its nostrils. Extremely bizarre, because in most ungulates, the nostrils are at the end of the muzzle. But in this litoptern, Macrauchenia patachonica, the nostrils, against all odds, were right on the top of the head. So far on the top of the head that they were actually behind the eyes, a bit like a whale.
Wow, that's beyond odd.
And what that means is that applying the normal method of asphyxiation that a lion uses, for example, that would certainly complicate matters. I'm not saying that it might not be possible to asphyxiate it by blocking off those nares, but there's nothing like a muzzle with a convenient pointy end that you can just clamp down on and shut down.
Yeah.
So now that and this has never, as far as I know, been pointed out in the literature. I've never seen it pointed out in the literature that the odd narial placement, the odd placement of the nostrils in Macrauchenia, the litoptern, might be related to an arms race with the saber-toothed cat, and indeed the lion, because it seems to be essentially an asphyxiation-proof anatomy. Yeah.
I realize we're coming up towards the end of our part 2, but I have 2 burning questions perhaps we could fit in before we end off. And that is, well, firstly, how do lions kill elephants then? I've never thought of that, because they do hunt elephants on occasion. And if they can't asphyxiate them, what is the method of killing them? And then the other question is, I don't think there was a smilodon in Africa. No saber-toothed cat that I'm aware of. Perhaps I'm wrong. And if that is the case, do you think it's possible that humans filled that niche for millions of years? Australopithecus was killing the mega herbivores, and therefore there wasn't a niche for a smilodon type cat.
I'm ashamed on hearing your questions to realize how ignorant and thoughtless I've been about both of those questions, because they're just such obvious questions, and yet I don't think I'll even try to answer them because I'll probably make a fool of myself. I need a bit more preparation. I mean, the business of the lion, Panthera leo, killing elephants has been filmed and documented in northern Botswana, which is apparently the only place that it's common. And so people do know this. People do know how the elephant is killed, but I don't know. I haven't paid enough attention to it. I do know that only juveniles are involved, and possibly weakened ones. But it still is an excellent question. How actually do they go about it? Do they just, essentially weigh it down with several attacking individuals of the lion and then exhaust it to death, or just basically mutilate it to the point that it expires? I don't know. I will find that out. And I'd encourage listeners to go and do their own research on it, because it's a really interesting question. And secondly, your other question, if I understand you right, is to say that in place of the saber-toothed cats of the Americas, which remained unpopulated by people until remarkably recently, we had in Africa and Eurasia a situation where the human was the saber-tooth. And it is indeed a fact that in the fossil history of Africa, even going into the Pleistocene, there have not been saber-tooths to speak of. Way back in earlier epochs, there were saber-tooths, but not the same sorts of saber-tooths that we're talking about now. And so from a biogeographical point of view, it does seem that the distribution of saber-tooths and the distribution of humans are mutually exclusive. And so it does seem that possibly at least part of the hunting niche of the human species in Africa has been to specialize on mega herbivores. Yes.
And it may be then, to come full circle in our part two, that a reason why the humans didn't populate the Americas was the saber-toothed cat was occupying our niche.
Well, not only that, I mean, Valerius Geist, may he rest in peace, who was one of the great ecologists of North America, he actually suggested that one of the reasons why it might have taken longer than expected for humans, once they entered the North American continent in Alaska, to penetrate south, was because they found such a guild of large carnivores living in North America that it actually stopped them in their tracks to some degree. Because when North American native people started moving south from Alaska, what they encountered was a lion, very similar to that in Africa, a saber-toothed cat, Smilodon fatalis, larger than the lion and more formidably armed, and an even bigger short-faced bear than the one that lives on the Pampas, a truly terrifying animal. If you think a grizzly is terrifying, well, a grizzly does not run particularly fast because it doesn't have long legs, and it's not a hyper carnivore. It's an omnivore. So this trio of predators, together with the dire wolf, really might have been life-threatening to human explorers for quite a while, until they managed to overcome them. So I think it's possible that not only did the saber-toothed cat in the Americas take the place of humans in specializing on killing megaherbivores, but it actually might have kept humans at bay for a while in concert with the other. If you ask me which would I be more scared of as an invading human in North America, I'd say probably the short-faced bear. You're dealing with an animal of I can't remember the exact body mass, but something approaching half a ton of carnivore on long legs with specialized hyena-like dentition. Something really to be feared.
Yeah.
So yes, so that introduces a whole constellation of questions about the relationship between the extinct hyper-carnivores, if you like, of the American supercontinent on the one hand, and the human being as a predator on the other hand.
And I'd imagine there wouldn't have been much love lost between the carnivores and the humans. It would have been a bit like hyenas and lions. The lions want to take out the hyenas, and I'd imagine those bears would have wanted to take out us.
Yes, well, it's hard to know in the sense that, there would have been no evolved response on the part of the bear to the human.
Yeah.
But it's worth mentioning just briefly what the relationship is between the lion and humans in modern Africa, because many people may not realize this, but the lion, Panthera leo, in, say, the Serengeti, is extremely timid around human beings. And you only have to watch what happens when a group of Maasai warriors, Morani, walk by in full sight of a group of resting lions. The lions become almost, they become obviously cowardly. There's avoidance behavior. Lions are basically scared of people. And that indicates that the selection pressure in evolutionary history has been for the human to be the more formidable predator. So, says that always kill a hyena or a leopard or a cheetah if it can. And the smaller subdominant carnivores like the hyena and possibly the leopard, they will also kill a larger carnivore if they can in the form of its juveniles or its infants. So there's no love lost on either side. But when it comes to the relationship between the modern African lion and humans, it's an asymmetric relationship, because wherever you find the lion together with indigenous populations of humans like the Maasai, it's the lion who's running scared. And it's not the case that the lion is hunting down its competitor, the human. So the human has the upper hand and puts the lion in its place. The lion is as scared of the Maasai as its own prey are scared of it, which is quite a sobering thought.
I suppose one can get a feel for what the experience of those early humans would have been by seeing how grizzly bears and other bears interact with humans today. they're certainly not the same fear that a lion has. Would you agree?
I would agree. I would agree with that. Yes. I have never been in grizzly bear territory, American brown bear territory. I haven't even been in black bear territory, really. But my impression is that the relationship between the brown bear and the human is one of the bear being essentially indifferent to the human, unless it's a mother with infants, and unless it's a large male. Large males are fairly unpredictable. In which case they can turn predaceous on humans. But it's not as if grizzly bears are hunting people down. So it's a bit of an ambivalent relationship there. But I don't think that they're running scared of humans in the way that the lions in Maasai land are running scared of Maasai people.
Yeah. I have walked in bear territory, and I would say that in general, there's a nervousness about encountering a bear, more so than the nervousness one experiences of encountering a lion when you're walking through the Kruger National Park with a ranger. The ranger is not particularly concerned about stumbling across lions, whereas if you're walking with someone in the forests of North America, they are very concerned about encountering bears.
Including the black bear?
Interesting.
Does that include the...
No, absolutely. Yeah. No, the black bear. Yeah. I was there as a student, and, the stories around the campfires it's a common story about how many people were killed by black bears the year before. Students just like us, collecting data. People are very nervous of those black bears, whereas the rangers in the Kruger Park, they're very casual around encountering a lion in the bush. Would you agree?
I would completely agree on the side of the lion. I have enough experience walking around in Africa to know that lions are not really to be taken seriously. As long as you know what you're doing and you're armed, they're basically scared of people. They really are. In the case of the black bear, the fact that we have to run scared of them in North America is particularly interesting, because even more than the grizzly, a black bear is not really a carnivore. It's an omnivore, and if anything, it likes fruits and honey or insects. Actually, if you were to caricaturize the black bear, which you shouldn't do because it's got a very general diet, but the one thing that you can say that it does eat is insects. It's more like an insectivore than anything else. And so the fact that animal, that omnivorous, insectivorous, mellivorous, frugivorous kind of animal, is such a threat against humans is really food for thought.
Absolutely. And imagine what the carnivorous bear would have been like in comparison.
Yeah, well, the big difference is that a black bear is a fairly cumbersome animal. I'm not sure. I wouldn't try to outrun a black bear. But if you were an early explorer, 10,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, coming across the grasslands of North America, trying to get south, and there was a short-faced bear, Arctodus simus, on an opposite hill slope a kilometer away, it's time to start running. It's time to start running.
Terrifying thought, That's why it took them 30,000 years to get there compared with Australia.
Well, that's very speculative and so forth. But it's an interesting thought. I mean, this is not an original thought. This is down to Valerius Geist, but it's an interesting thought. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Well, in part 3, we can perhaps come back to how lions kill elephants. But what else will we be exploring about the Pampas?
Well, I think in part 3, let's look at the lesser fauna of the Pampas, the medium-sized mammals, which are again surprisingly diverse, and the smaller mammals, some of which survived the modern day. And then when we've done that, we can start piecing together the whole puzzle. It'll probably take us several more episodes after that. But today we only covered the mega herbivores, and that's spectacular as those animals are. They're only a fraction of the actual mammalian fauna of the Pampas.
Excellent, thanks. Look forward to it, and see the listeners soon in part 3.
Yes, listeners, thank you for being here today. Please like, subscribe, and share us with your friends. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Great.